Some games seem impenetrably deep or complicated for new players, yet still manage to find a solid audience. These games, although they are good-looking and fun to play, can be brutal to new players. In this video, we'll be looking at 10 games which can be quite hard on new players. Stay tuned. Escape from Tarkov. We start off the list with an FPS game called Escape from Tarkov. This is a hardcore first-person shooter with some MMO elements, and it has a pretty basic concept. You start a game spawning on one side of the map and have to make it to the other side without dying, which, is easier said than done. Along the way, you'll have to deal with AI-driven scavengers and other players that are looking to steal your loot. That's where a big part of the learning curve comes in. If you die, other players can take pretty much anything you've got on you. Survival in this game is dependent on what your equipment is before starting. So if you decide to spend all of your hard-earned cash on some sweet new weapons, but then get shot in the back, you're basically sent back to square one. So that money's gone and so is your weapons. There are a few ways to protect your inventory at least. You can obtain secure containers that function as permanent safe inventory slots, and you can buy insurance. So if there's something good you really want to keep, there are ways to do that. But surviving is very tough, since this is one of those hardcore shooters where death can literally come at any second. You'd think that the AI scavengers wandering around would be chumps, but they're not. They're very accurate and they're very dangerous if they see you. Sometimes scavengers are like the other players, and that makes them even more dangerous. We haven't gotten into all the complex systems in the game, like how any ammo left in a magazine stays with it, and how you have to keep track of how much ammo is in each individual mag. That's the level of complexity we're talking about here. Dota II. Dota 2 is a far easier game in comparison to Escape to Tarkov. The mechanics aren't really complex, but if you actually want to win, things get a bit ugly. What makes Dota 2 so difficult is the amount of heroes. There's a lot of them. Every single one has different strengths and weaknesses, and if you want to do well in a game, you need to have at least a cursory understanding of what all of them are capable of. Not only from an offensive perspective, where you have to be able to execute viable strategies, but also defensive. And snowballing is absolutely a thing in this game. So if you're not pulling your weight, things can quickly get out of hand. Compared to a lot of multiplayer games where dying isn't a big deal, if you die a lot in Dota 2, you're actively helping your opponents win. That's at least partially the reason that the community for this game is considered a little toxic. It can be really frustrating, even if you're a veteran. Armored Core series. Now, if you want to talk about hardcore shooters, you look no further than the Armored Core games. First, the mech customization is extremely complicated and in-depth, and you could make a ton of mistakes. The controls can be a little awkward and are frankly difficult to get used to, and the mission design, depending on the game, can be absolutely brutal. Common consensus is that the hardest games in the series are Armored Core 2 and Last Raven. Last Raven is especially cruel, with some of its missions that kill you in seconds right as the game starts. If that's not discouraging to new players, I don't know what's gonna be. Arma 3. Arma 3 is considered the ultimate military simulator game. Just running around and shooting just seems like the most complicated thing once you start playing this game. Everything's slower, more deliberate, more realistic, and death can come in an instant from a stray bullet fired by someone you can't even see or hear. Situational awareness is pretty much the name of the game in Arma 3, so learning to navigate the many maps, communication systems, and radar functions, it's essential to understanding this game. Vehicles only add to the complexity too. Just learning to fly a helicopter without crashing, is going to feel nearly impossible at first. At least the game is known to have a pretty forgiving and friendly community, so that's at least one hurdle new players aren't going to have to deal with. But everything else, this one's tough to penetrate. Kerbal Space Program. This space flight simulator might look like a walk in the park, but it is no joke. The main challenge of the game is to create functional rockets and fly them into space, which sounds very simple. But everything on your ship is simulated using actual Newtonian dynamic, so blowing up mid-flight isn't just a possibility when you first start out, it's very likely. There's a career mode that's pretty thorough about how everything works, but it's also still pretty difficult to wrap your head around everything, especially if you're not like a math nerd. Getting to the moon, or the mun, as it's called in the game, is really step one, and the game just gets exponentially more difficult from there. It's a game that starts out really hard and keeps getting harder the deeper you get into it. Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead. Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead is a game that can best be described as a wall of death for newcomers. There's no tutorials, everything's going to kill you, and if you want even a chance of survival, you need to figure out the game's somewhat obtuse control scheme. In a nutshell, the game's a roguelike zombie survival simulator, which sounds, basically you've heard that a million times, right? But believe me, it is not. It's a survival game first, so death comes in many forms. You can die of hunger, thirst, heat, exhaustion. There's just many ways to die in this game. You can get sick, you can get addicted to drugs. There's a million possibilities. And it's the realistic details that can really catch you off guard. Like if you fire a gun inside, it affects your hearing. That's the level of detail we're talking about here. And one of the most complex mechanics here is the crafting system. This game is so complex you can get information regarding calories of something or whether an item conducts electricity or not. Dwarf Fortress. Now you can't make a list like this without mentioning Dwarf Fortress. Just looking at this game is baffling enough. For new players, it can be difficult to tell what you're even supposed to be looking at, and that feeling doesn't go away for a long time. The ASCII art is a huge wall to get over, but once you actually get into the game, things don't get easier. The premise of the game is a classic build a thriving settlement type thing. It's basically fantasy The Sims. If you started out with absolutely nothing, and your Sims were all manic depressive dwarfs trying to survive in an underground death trap. It's a famously complex game, with systems layered on top of systems that simulate everything from minor bruises to entire extinct civilizations. Just keeping your dwarfs alive is a tall enough order, and the amount of things that can kill them are nearly infinite. If you don't give them enough booze or sleep, they go berserk. Actually, pretty much anything makes these guys go on a killing rampage. It's kind of hilarious, but also baffling at the same time. Really, the hardest part to get past with this game is the interface. Online. In terms of complexity in MMOs, there's nothing as intimidating as Online. A lot of people jokingly call it Spreadsheet the game, and that's not entirely wrong. There's so much to keep track of in this game at any given time, and just staying afloat as one ship is difficult enough. EVE Online, however, is a game all about cooperation. We could spend this entire point just talking about the corps and how difficult they can be to organize. But just at a basic level, looking at the interface can be overwhelming with the amount of options and menus you have available. Like many games on this list, EVE Online is a game that greatly benefits from online tutorials as well as help from other players. Maybe the most intimidating thing about it is that while there's a lot to gain by playing EVE Online, there's also a lot to lose. The game's hardcore. If you lose your ship, that's it, it's gone. Here's an interesting statistic. Nearly 600,000 new players joined Online in 2018. Of those, a mere 10% still play the game today. That's how hardcore this game is. Aurora. When people think of complicated 4X games, the first thing that comes to mind are the Paradox games. Stuff like Europa Universalis, Crusader Kings, or Hearts of Iron. These are all complex, especially now for a new player starting out, but they are nothing compared to Aurora. Those games have pictures, a proper map, and user interface elements. Aurora? No, not so much. Instead of the comparatively lush visual design of the Paradox games, you get a ton of Windows menus, all as a jumbled mess, and some basic ASCII art to give you a vague approximation of the universe. To call this game primitive in the visual department would be, calling it an understatement is an understatement. But in terms of pure simulation, it's probably one of the most complex 4X games out there. DCS World. In terms of simulation gameplay, there's really just nothing else like this game. You want the closest possible experience of flying a fighter jet outside of literally flying one? This game's got you covered. The realism is out of control. Depending on the aircraft you're wanting to fly, just the simple process of turning the plane on and getting it in the air is complex. Tons of switches, tons of buttons. All these things have to be done in an order that has consequences. And the game doesn't do any of it automatically. You gotta figure all that stuff out yourself. There's a reason players describe this game as being 20% flying and 80% studying. Because if you want to fly certain jets, like the FA-18 or something like that, you basically have to be flight certified for one in real life. This game is really complex, and if you aren't flight certified, you basically can't play this game. All that information is going to be really useful to you, so make sure to spend hours on end learning how to fly. Alright guys, that's all for this video. Hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.